Here we go. Just admitting everyone as they come in. It's going to be a full house, so we're expecting around 100, over 100 or so. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters, welcome. Before we start, you're in the right session. This is the Islamic Courses session titled Ottoman Caliphate, Political Thought and Islamic Constitutionalism. We have our distinguished guests and hosts, Dr. Ahmed Salim, who's the editor-in-chief of the Maidan, Dr. Hüseyin Yılmaz, who's the author of the Caliphate Redefined, and Dr. Yakoob Ahmed from Istanbul University. Before I hand it over to Dr. Ahmed, just a kind reminder of the housekeeping rules. Please keep your phones, well, you're already muted, but if you do unmute your phone somehow, please keep them on mute. Whether it's your phones or devices, whatever you're doing. It is being recorded, so if you're not already registered, do leave your email address here and you'll get a copy of the actual session. And there is a questions and answers session as well. So write the questions down here on the chat. You won't be able to share chats with yourselves, just to me. This is just for security purposes. We're going to start in the next minute or two. I'm just going to allow everyone in. It's a full house, so we're expecting nearly over 100 people or so. So thank you so much for those who registered and coming in. It is a very unique session to have. We have two scholars, both in Istanbul. We've never met each other, so it's interesting. And then we have someone all the way in the US as well, and me in London. So it's an amazing thing about Zooms, right?
Yeah.
It's serene. Alhamdulillah. Okay, I think we can start anyway. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So let me introduce you to my host. It is Dr. Ahmed Salim, who's the editor-in-chief of the Maidan. If you want to know more about the Maidan, we're going to be talking about that. The Maidan.com, and it's a project of the Ali Vural AK Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason University at the US of A. But just a reminder to everyone, this is the session on Ottoman Caliphate, Political Thought and Islamic Constitutionalism. So I'm going to, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ahmed Salim. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Salim, assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, for organizing this. Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Ahmed Salim Tekilolu. I'm joining you from the East Coast in the US, and we have a treat for us today. I'm already seeing some friends that I've never met in person, but this is the times that we are meeting virtually, mashallah. So our session today on Ottoman Caliphate, Political Thought and Ottoman Constitutionalism with two experts in this field, hopefully will shed some light on this still, strangely enough, understudied field. We'll start off with Professor Hüseyin Yılmaz, Professor of History at George Mason University, where I have the privilege of working with him together at the Vural Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason. Where he has been situated for about 6 years, if I'm not mistaken, Hüseyin Hocam. And he previously served as lecturer and professor at Stanford University, at University of Southern Florida. And previously he was at Harvard University, where he completed his PhD. And the book that he has written, published from Princeton University Press in 2018, Caliphate Redefined, with the subtitle The Mystical Turn in Ottoman Political Thought, came out of his years of work. We'll start with Hüseyin Hocam, and we'll move to Dr. Yakoob Ahmed, a lecturer at the Faculty of Theology at Istanbul University, Istanbul Ilahiyat, who finished his PhD at SOAS, and who has been in Istanbul for 5 years now. Hüseyin Hoca was on sabbatical this year, so he is also in Istanbul. So our speakers are in Istanbul, and mashallah, it seems like we have a global audience here. Without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Hüseyin Hoca. Hüseyin Hocam, I guess what everyone would love to hear in the next 10 minutes or so from you was, some of the questions that you address in the book that came out to a good reception. What were some of your concerns? Why Ottoman political thought is still relatively understudied? And what are some of the myths and misconceptions, perhaps, that you try to address in the book? Importantly, the book talks about how Ottoman Sufis engage with political thought and how they shaped. So the floor is yours. I know the time is not potentially limited enough to cover everything, but I am sure our audience will benefit from that. After you, we will move to Dr. Ahmed and listen from him on Ottoman constitutionalism, and then we'll go to the Q&A session. Please.
Well, thank you very much, and greetings to everybody from Istanbul. It looks like nowadays everybody's on the Zoom, so there is no actually difference between London and Istanbul, because I'm talking to my next door friend through the Zoom anyways. So you're closer to me than Yakoob here. So I'd like to thank Mizan and Ahmed and all the other organizers for hosting me in this very special program and giving the opportunity to engage with this distinguished audience. So without losing much time, in response to Ahmed's generous introduction and question, I'd like to just highlight a few aspects of my overall research and the book, and give you some snapshot of Ottoman political thought, perhaps with the intention of opening up a broader discussion. So I wrote the book to begin with in response to three major historiographic questions. One was the old Orientalist dictum about Ottoman intellectual history, that the Ottomans were not creative. All scientific, cultural, and intellectual accomplishments in Islamic history were carried out in medieval Islam, and since then the Ottomans were simply good administrators and a military power. Secondly, it was about the caliphate itself. We had very similar understanding of the caliphate, in the sense that the broader historiography on the question was that at the time of the Abu Bakr, caliphate was somehow instituted, and then the rest is just a political history. There is no change or dynamism or discontinuities. It's just a political history. There is no intellectual, theoretical, or cultural aspects studied in the case of the caliphate. So it was basically an institutional, political, administrative history of the caliphate. And the third one was the broader impact of the mystical transformation in the broader Islamic world from 11th century onwards, which profoundly changed all aspects of Muslim societies. And I would like to see how it transformed the very notion of political authority in Muslim societies as well. And from that perspective, I worked on the case of the Ottoman Caliphate. On the question of the progression of Ottoman political thought, in the first century, from roughly 1300 to 1400, we cannot really speak about Ottoman political thought. It was a frontier society. There was tribal imageries of authority, much less engagement with the broader Muslim society. And the Ottoman elite, by and large, at least the administrators, were not quite engaged with learning. Ottoman rulers, in all likelihood, were themselves illiterate. However, that all changed with the Battle of Ankara in 1402, when the Ottomans were expanding towards the Balkans and inner Anatolia. All of a sudden, they were defeated by a much more sophisticated power. And that led to a political crisis and a crisis of conscience among the Ottomans. So roughly from 1400 to the conquest of Istanbul, it was a time of self-reflection among the Ottomans and reconstruction of what the Ottomans envisioned themselves to become politically and socially and culturally. We can talk about the details as to how it happened. And then from 1453 to roughly mid-16th century, we have the imperial age in which the Ottomans were aggressively engaged with the broader Islamic learning, as well as many other learning traditions, including Europe, Asia, and then transmission of knowledge into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire modeled itself on the basis of many working historical models from the past, but they were not yet seeing themselves as a role model. So the Sassanids, the Empire of Alexander, the Abbasid Empire, the Seljukids, the Timurids, even the empires of China, they were all studied through a very intensive study of history books and works on political thought, and the Ottomans modeled their ideas of authority, notions of good governance, and administrative institutions by being inspired by those earlier models. However, from mid-16th century onwards, the Ottoman intellectuals mostly turned into their own experience. So they continued to highlight their own accomplishments and their own institutions and ideas and ideals as defining factors of what it means to be an Ottoman in terms of culture, in terms of political authority. So that's the four major phases of Ottoman political thought. In the case of Ottoman Caliphate, however, the book talks about how the Caliphate itself was transformed around 13th century onwards under the influence of mystical visions. And that, I think, a transformative impact on all areas of Muslim societies from 13th century onwards. And the Ottomans happened to be immersed in the most sort of the wilderness of intellectual activity. So Western Anatolia lacked any imperial control at the time, because we are talking about the period just in the wake of Mongol invasions. The Abbasid Caliphate was ended catastrophically in 1258. And then there were scattered Muslim communities in Anatolia. None of them were very well engaged into the major centers of Islamic learning. We have Sufis and ulama, of course, traveling to Damascus, to Halep, to Cairo, but there were no major learning institutions yet in Western Anatolia at the time. So that lack of epistemological and political authority led to a new kind of or new kinds of notions of authority among both Sufis and political leaders. So in that context, Sufi orders, for example, such as Bektashis or Mevlevis, emerged as autonomous social structures. Their claim was that they were in no need of being loyal subjects to any external temporal political authority. So they were in competition, unless they are in symbiotic relationship with political orders or principalities in Western Anatolia. So my argument was that in that context, it was the temporal rulers, such as the Ottomans, who mostly took up from Sufis as to what good governance was, or what caliphate or what rulership in general or authority meant, and what it entailed, not vice versa. So those Sufi leaders, such as Rumi, were all had royal titles in themselves, but not in the temporal sense. And that's actually the major question of the book. So what was the principal question of authority at time that profoundly transformed the very notion of the caliphate, and that was the very question of who Prophet Muhammad was in the beginning. So as we know from the earlier Islamic history, that it became quite customary to portray Muhammad as having three major natures. Okay, so in short, those natures were nubuwa, wilaya, and sultana, namely prophethood, sainthood, and executive power. And then again, as the constituencies of Muslim society, the principal constituencies of Muslim society formed, they happen to claim those natures of the Prophet. For example, the ulama historically maintained that they represent the Prophet's nature of the nubuwa. So they speak for the religion. So nubuwa is about revelation, about God's will, about how to understand the Quran. So ulama became the representatives of prophets that nature. So ulama in themselves always felt that they have that embedded authority as a constituency, not as an individual. Same was true for the executive rulers. The historically built caliphs, like the Umayyad caliphs or the Abbasid caliphs, and then afterwards, they claimed that they represent the Prophet's executive power, because the Prophet was believed to have that nature as well. And then the Sufis also thought they represent the Prophet's sainthood, friendship to God. So the question was then, which nature of the Prophet prevails over the others? So who is obeying who in this ideal society? Is it the ulama that Sufis and sultans should obey, or is the sultan, both ulama and the Sufis should obey? So that's a contradiction, that's a conflict. But the Sufi interpretation that evolved from 12th century onwards was that no, this was a fragmentation. So Prophet's authority is one, the unified authority of all three natures. After the death of the Prophet, that authority was fragmented into three major components claimed by three major constituencies. So that in ideal authority, all these three should be combined. So Sufis claimed that since the Prophet, the goal and the struggle was, among the Sufia at least, was to reunify this fragmented nature of authority. And they happen to claim to have unified that in their personas. So it's not a coincidence that from 12th century onwards, we see a number of Sufis claimed that full authority. So they felt they don't owe any loyalty to temporal rulers, nor they owe loyalty to the ulama. They claimed all three, having felt that they combined it in themselves. So that created a conflict, a tension between autonomous Sufi orders and those temporal leaders. However, through a symbiotic relationship, the Ottomans themselves picked up those ideals and refashioned themselves as such. So Ottoman rulership evolved into one that is mystical. So Ottoman ruler is a mystic. So he had claim now on both the nubuwa nature of the Prophet and the sainthood nature of the Prophet. So that was the, so any less would look inferior to other claimants around. So that created a whole new understanding of the caliphate based on a reinterpretation of authority on earth as manifestation of the broader cosmic order. So that created a rupture.
A time check if in the next 2-3 minutes, yeah. Thank you.
Rupture between the historical caliphate and the mystical caliphate. Historical caliphate was purely political authority. Okay, but that political authority ended with the Abbasids. And that political authority was framed and theorized by jurists, especially 10th century jurists. That ended historically. So after 1258, there is no historical caliphate. That continuity ended. The new caliphate could only be legitimized and explained in much more mystical, sophistic terms as the divine authority's manifestation on earth. So the major proponents of this theory became Ibn Arabis or Rumis or such Sufis who considered now Caliph as true manifestation of God's very traits.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hüseyin, for this. This was quite the summary, and I know it was challenging, but we thank you for managing that. I am sure that will be able to follow-up questions on many aspects of this in the Q&A session. So now we are moving to Dr. Yakoob Ahmed for his presentation. His research and expertise looked at the role of the ulama in the parliamentary elections of 1908 and 1912, and an examination also of the famous/infamous Committee of Union and Progress. So Dr. Ahmed, I think from you we'll hear about modernization efforts, constitutionalism, and how the role of ulama and the role of political thought came into those processes. We are looking forward to this. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Just quickly, assalamu alaikum to my students. You're annoying me on WhatsApp. I'm talking right now, so don't send me any messages. So before I start, I just hope that everyone is well and healthy. I think I need to make that appeal. I mean, we are in difficult times, and it's part of, it's part of our aqidah to have trust in Allah Ta'ala in this wonderful month. So please do turn to Him, and please be safe, keep yourself healthy, and protect those that need protecting. My work's it's the time gap between mine and Hüseyin Hoxha's work. There's a huge jump. When I went into the PhD, I had no real interest of looking at constitutional discourse or modernity or secularism or any of these things. I was fascinated by a photograph of ulama in the parliament. That was my fascination. Seeing these turban class people in the parliament, and the idea was, well, what were they doing there? And they were very visible. And so as a result of that, what happens is, as I start looking at that photographs and visual imagery is so important these days. I mean, we're in an Instagram generation, and as we know, we like to look at photos, and I used to have Instagram at one point, is that I'm a visual learner. I like to see things. But what happened is that visual medium took me into an intellectual space, which is what was the reasoning behind them being there? And I came to the conclusion that it was constitutional discourse. Now, as I started to dissect this idea of constitutionalism, one of the things that was quite common within the works of Ottoman history in particular is that this was Western inspired. So I had done Islamic studies in the past, and the key theme in Islamic studies is to go after the ulama of the 19th century. And the idea is that there's been some sort of like a decline in intellectual thought amongst the religious class, some sort of decadence or some sort of submission inadvertently towards Western ideology. And the narrative of modernity does that. So, those of you who, like the works of White Halak and so forth, you see this. The idea of modernity is a bit of a problem, and this meta-narrative of modernity beginning in the 19th century, it goes into the period that we're in now, and what went wrong. It's the what went wrong question that Bernard Lewis puts forward. And I actually bought into that. I bought into that until I started looking at the evidences themselves and started to see that it's a bit more messier than that. And I don't know if that meta-narrative of modernity and modernization is helpful. one of the things that I would put forward, for example, is that when you look at Halak's work on the impossible state and the idea of projecting that back on the Ottoman domains, well, you have to understand this is an empire, and I use the word empire loosely here, that stretches across 3 continents. And the idea that the possibility that you could actually centralize the domains of that size with the constituents that they have in nomadic areas, religious areas, conservative areas, urbanized areas, multiple centers and so forth, and to be able to, as Benedict Anderson says, take the skin of modernity and stretch it over empire. It's actually, I didn't find that plausible. I found that problematic. And one of the questions that needs to be asked is whether an empire of that nature could ever be modern in the way that the modern nation state is being constructed in the minds of many. And so I start to think along these lines, right? Now, as I started to look at it from the Western academic point of view, I had a different audience, which was a Muslim audience, who looked at that period in a totally different way, in a totally different paradigm. And how they internalized that period was one of failure, loss, decline, and what's gone wrong. So in some ways, the narrative was the same, but the perspective was different. And a lot of Muslims, and I've said this before, they had what I found a real sort of amnesia of that period, which is surprising because it's so close to the period that we're in. The nation states are formed, we are projects of the nation states, or at least in that sense. And how is it that we were unable as historians to see that transition? And for those of you who don't know, I live in Turkey, and identity is very raw here. I used to live in Damascus, and identity was very strong. The nation state identity was exceptionally strong. And when we look at Syria, for example, right now, and some would argue that there's a combustion taking place within nations like Syria and Iraq, how does that identity play out? So Syrians who are in Turkey, for example, how does that work in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years? Would they still subscribe to being Syrian when we're seeing a transition taking place regarding the nation state of Syria? And it's not only Syria, the whole region, the nation state model is transmutating to some degree. And what does that mean for identity? And what I realize is the Ottoman past of that period in particular becomes important. It becomes important because that gap in the memory is not only impacting our understanding of history of that period, but it's a reflection of, to some degree, the position we're in right now, in that sense. So what I started to notice was this notion of revolution, right? And initially, the narrative is it's a Young Turk revolution. And those of you who don't know, the Young Turks are known as these military militiamen and intellectuals who are presented as inclined towards a sort of like a fetishization of Europe. And they take these ideas into the empire and they try to transform the empire into something which is modern along the lines of the European powers. Okay, we can put that to the side. But then I start to look at the works of the ulama, and I see a very different, what I would call knowledge base, and a very different empire and a very different state structure. What I start to realize is that the ulama had moved against Sultan Abdul Hamid in 1908 in regards to the revolution. And why would that have happened? Now, that might sound strange if you just look at the Hamidian period as a independent period. But if you go back 100 years to the period of Sultan Selim III and then Mahmud II, you see something similar happening at the same time. What you start to realize is that there is contestation for power. What you start to realize is there's revolution, there's revolt, there's obedience and disobedience. And all of these questions, Muslims feel very uncomfortable raising regarding the historical past. And yet it seems that for those actors at the time, these questions were very real. And so the way they looked at power and authority was very different in the way that we are, in some ways, creating a nostalgia of that past, right? And so what I notice is you see the contestation of power is between various institutions. And the contestation or the balance of power, we call it, is not actually like that. It's actually like that, constantly. And it's not actually two-way, it's multiple. So we're actually seeing multiple actors pushing and pulling to try to position themselves. And this is never a static position, and it's continuously moving. In that sense, Talal Asad's idea of Islam being a discursive tradition is helpful, because you start to see, as the conditions are changing, the various actors vis-a-vis Islam and state politics and society are also evolving in accordance to what's necessary at the time. I then like the idea of Armando Salvatore, who talks about the idea of the meta-institution. I like that, because when we look at the ulama, then the ulama are not an institution in my eyes. They are a meta institution. The members of the ulama would do people's marriages, they would do funerals, they would be imams at the mosques, they would be judges, they would be on the streets and demonstrations, they were journalists, they were parliamentarians, and they were a legislative force still in the 19th century that could hold the Sultan as Caliph to account. That mustn't be forgotten. And so 1908, which is the work that I look at, I don't see it as a moment of ulama decline. I see it as an opportunity that the ulama see for themselves. They see themselves as having this opportunity. And this opportunity occurs in 1908 because in 1826, Mahmud II abolishes the Janissaries. And the Janissaries were a physical force that were holding the Sultan to account. And that is really interesting for me, in that sense that once the abolishment of the Janissaries takes place, we now see the changing conditions within the Ottoman domains. And so this is nothing, in that sense, external pressure. This seems to be something far more indigenous and local, right? Now, I'm not going to say that there is an influence from the outside. So one of the points that I put forward is, rather than looking at the Ottomans as being colonized, and this is what's happened in Islamic studies, they've looked at all the Muslim world as a colonized entity. The Ottomans weren't colonized. There's an intervening of colonialism. I'll give you that, the intervening of colonialism. But the Ottomans were abolished. It's a very different worldview. And to some degree, the Ottomans are negotiating on the one hand with this like threat that's coming from outside, and on the other hand, trying to get their house in order. And to some degree, they are still an obstacle to the global world order. And that's why the Ottomans are unique in that sense regarding Muslim history. The Ottomans are very different in regards to India, and parts of Africa and China, because they had resisted the world order to a long degree, right? And the ulama then become really important because unlike in India or so forth, the ulama are part of the configuration of power. They're part of that configuration of power, and they remain the part of the configuration of power until something similar happens to them during the formation of the Turkish Republic, which is what happened to the Janissaries, right? So then the ulama get gutted out of the Turkish Republic and in various Balkan states and so forth. And then in the Arab provinces, the ulama make a different negotiation and they try to survive in this sense. What you see after the collapse of the Ottomans in 24 is like what we call a fiqh al-siyasa is gone, right? So now this ideology or the study of politics and the caliphate system is out the window. But then you see the emergence of what we call Muslim revivalist movements to try to address the caliphate question. So that then still becomes important because the need or the memory of the revivalists come from the idea of the consequence of what happens in the 19th century. The fact that that 19th century memory is missing means that there's a huge gap in understanding what these early Islamist movements were trying to do. And I use the word Islamist loosely here before anyone attacks me. I mean, I can't find another word for it in the English medium, right? And so maybe even right now, we could be asking a question that the ideas are still very prevalent amongst Muslims today, but the idea of movements has changed. Do we have to be dependent on movements or not is another debate that can be had. When we live on the ground here, you can see the baggage of what's taking place. So for me, this is what the main interest point was. And it's very loaded. It was a 4-year PhD that I realized was a project that was far bigger than 4 years. And it's a 4-year PhD that no way could I condense in 10 minutes. But the idea is, the hope is that I can get enough people out there interested in the subject area in regard to so many of these trees that need to be chopped down. I mean, this is a spider web. It's not just you're looking at one issue. So I start to look at the notion of modernity and whether that's helpful as an idea, the notion of secularism. And is this a discursive secularization of the Ottoman domains? Or is this that foreign entities come in the Ottoman domains and then they become Islamized, right? So that's a question worth asking, the Islamization of the secular, if we want to look at it in that context. That continuously happens. And if we can see that in regards to Ottoman architecture, Ottoman art, Ottoman food, and so forth, then why not in regards to politics? So the key question I'm asking is the idea of constitutionalism. And there's 2 verses in the Quran that become very consistent in the 19th century. The first one is in Surah Nisa, so verse 50, ayah 59, which is, "O you who believe, ya ayyuhal lazina amanu," and then obey Allah, obey the messenger and those in authority from amongst you. This verse is used by the Naqshbandis in support of Sultan Salim III. It's used in support of Mahmud II, and it's once again used in support of Abdul Hamid II by Yusuf al-Nabahani and many of the Sufi inclined ulama. But in 1909, Hamdi Yazır uses the same verse to oppose Abdul Hamid. So the verse itself, and maybe in the Q&A I can break this verse down in terms of how it becomes really interesting, because the ulama argue that this verse in itself has a constitutional component. It has a contractual component within the verse itself, right? And the verse itself talks about the multiple authorities that should exist within Islamic political discourse. Not only that, the verse is a political one. And that's really unique here in that sense, that it's a political one. The second verse in the Quran, in which continuously comes in the works, is Surah Al-Imran, and Ayah Al-Imran, and Surah Al-Imran, Ayah 159, which is, and consult them, okay? To turn to the consultation. So it's وَشَوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, right? And this idea that consultation as an idea is far better as a political system or a political intellectual process than authoritarianism. And you see this constant moving of backwards and forwards between two verses. I mean, these two ideals of what type of good governance is political governance. And if we were to go forward in time, to look at the works of Iqbal and Muhammad Asad and so forth, in the Indo-Pak region, when they're writing about political discourse, they talk about these two subject areas again. That's not a vacuum. That's coming from a particular past. They're not just bringing it out of their heads with light bulbs. This means that they were interacting with a world and a worldview of the 19th and 20th century. And this was indigenous to people in terms of the conversations on the ground. And that's what I found fascinating and interesting. So it's this.
Yakoob, another 3 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So that's what, I mean, I don't want to bore you guys. I know so many of you like thinking, what is he talking about? Because I can be quite boring in that context. And, I really do enjoy what I do, actually, to be honest, but I don't talk to people about it because I put them to sleep. But the idea is that this is what I found fascinating. This whole idea of obedience, disobedience, revolution, revolt, the idea of violence, the notion of justice in itself, and the idea of retribution in justice, right? So often when we look at the idea of justice, we sometimes miss the idea there's a notion of retribution. So sometimes when revolutions were being executed, the call of justice was being made, and that's a very violent act. And not only is there a revolution, but these are revolutionary phases, which means there's a counter-revolution, and these go backwards and forwards. Okay, and this is really important to understand how power and authority works then, in terms of how these different actors are pushing and pulling and so forth. So the main key of the work is, once again, this Muslim contestation for power and how we internalize that. So I hope that was okay, and I'm within my time limit. All right, cool.
No. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So we do have about 10 minutes of some quick interaction between the two of you, and we are already seeing some great questions in the chat. We'll start off with one question from Yahya Birds, but I wanted to first maybe invite you to, both of you have covered this both temporal and spatial sort of aspects are embedded in this. So I want to start off maybe with a conversation on that, the temporal jump, Yakoob, that you addressed. And Hüseyin Hocam, maybe a question for you in terms of how that political imagination spatially worked as the Sufi networks, globally, and as Ottoman rule expanded. Perhaps if both of you could address these aspects in the next 10 minutes in conversation with one another about constitutionalism, about political theory, I think our audience would benefit from that.
Thank you, Ahmed. That's a very long question to answer, but we can start at least. The space was, the Ottoman space was political as much as spiritual. So Sufis claim to have authority in the spiritual space over the entire realm. So this was an inherent conflict with temporal orders, if those claims are made public, of course. So in the nature of Sufistic authority that formed at the time, the Sufi sheikhs, as they call them, Pol, Qutb, or Gauss, the Succor of God, in whatever way they label them. Sometimes they call them royal names such as Hunkar, Persian, sometimes as Shah, sometimes they were called as sultans. So they all claim to have that uncompromised spiritual authority over the temporal space as well. So that wasn't negotiable, unless, of course, it was made public. Okay. At the same time, over the same geographic space, the Sultan also claimed authority. So how do you reconcile that? There was a range of arrangements and negotiations, not formally, but at many levels, those negotiations took place and compromises was made. One compromise was to tacitly admit each other's authority in their respective spheres, while at the same time not giving up their claim for the overall authority. A good example of this is hagiographies or texts of political thought. Okay, in Sufi hagiographies, for example, we have so many examples in which there are encounters between temporal rulers and the Sufi sheikh. So in those arrangements, for example, a temporal ruler such as Mehmed II, the conqueror of Istanbul, Constantinople, comes to a sheikh, okay, such as Ashraf al-Rumi. And then he says, I would like to give up all authority because you have the real authority on earth. So I want to be just your servant on earth. And in the hagiography, in this story, it goes, the sheikh says, no, it's not proper that you give up your authority, but you act as a sultan. So the lesson of all these encounters was that the real wielder of unified authority of the prophet was the sheikh itself. The sultan, the earthly sultan, was the sheikh's representative in the political space. We have many elaborate such stories. But on the other hand, the apologetics of the sultan, the courtiers came up with similar stories and made up similar theories in their text of political thought. So in short, there was a tacit understanding that the real authority is in the spiritual space, and the temporal authority is just inferior and reports to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And Dr. Ahmed, in your case too, you've alluded to different notions of statehood and nation state and the impact of different ideas across different spaces. And I'm seeing some questions that I think we'll further elaborate this when we get to Q&A in just a minute. Mm-hmm. How did the Ottoman, the intra-Ottoman discussions and reflections were received or were reacted to by others?
What do you mean by others?
By others outside of the Ottoman experience in the Muslim world, as whether in India, whether in the Arab world around the same time.
I mean, so one of the things I want to stress is that we don't see borders in the Ottoman domains until at least the late Hamidian period, okay? So as a result of that, I mean, we have frontier regions, but there's a lot of movement and bleeding that's taking place within the Ottoman domain. And mm-hmm. I've always made the case, let's look at Africa, for example, right? And the belt between Sudan to Mauritania. And that Ottoman influence in that belt has totally been lost. And yet what's fascinating is, for example, when the Balkans are being lost, like the Greek War of Independence, or the Greek Revolution, or whatever you want to call it, Sudan has become part of Egypt. So while there's something that's being lost, there's something that's being gained in Africa. And so actually there's a shifting of frontiers that's taking place. And the point, or reason why I'm making this point, is that the Ottoman experience of interaction with the Muslim world, by and large, was very extensive. And we underestimate that. I mean, of course, we have the assumption that today's globalization is far more excessive than the globalization of the past. But the way that I look at the Ottoman domains is connected centers. So we have the supra center, which is Istanbul, but then we have connected centers. Now, what that means is like Konya is a center, Cairo is a center, Beirut is a center. And these centers are interconnected with other centers in their sphere of influence. So we have local manifestations, we have translocal manifestations, and we have global manifestations. And one of the ways of looking at the Ottoman domains is that there are people who are working from a local level, a translocal level, and then a global level. And the ulama in particular become important here because just like the idea of the ummah, they transcend these spaces. They are moving scholars, they have the capacity to move around, their ideas move around, their works move around. And to some degree, they create a connection via these spaces. That's why I like the idea of them being a meta institution, right? So what you start to see is places like Africa, places like the Arab Peninsula, which is part of the Ottoman domains. Sorry, North Africa. And, you know, even as far as India, the Turkic states, China, that they have some level of idea of the Ottoman Caliphate as an idea. Now, they probably don't know the intricacies of the details. Like, for example, I live in Istanbul now, and this is a very politicized society. And so I know the ins and outs of Turkish politics in a way that Muslims in Britain wouldn't know. That's a given. Having said that, that doesn't mean that people are ignorant around the world. There's still a connectivity in regards to just these meta ideas. I think the Muslim world did have an affinity towards these multiple centers. And it's not just Istanbul, by the way. It would have been to centers in the Balkans, it would have been Konya, it would have been Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, and so forth. So I think we need to look at this very differently in the way that we're looking at it now. We have to get out of this nation-state prison and really understand that maybe the world was connected in a way that we're not giving it credit for. And maybe ideas, which are a lot harder to chase, by the way, because as a historian, the only way you can look at an idea is if it's been documented on paper. And a lot of these scholars didn't need to document things. They just move around. I mean, I can give you an example of myself. I'm a very private person. I don't want to be visible. I want to just mind my own business. And even this intrusion of people who can see my house right now has made me quite uncomfortable. And so ulama are moving around and they're talking to people and who knows? And so as a historian, what I noticed is I saw an idea in Shkodra in the Albanian provinces. And I saw that same idea in Jerusalem. And I saw that same idea in Cairo. And I'm thinking, well, why is these ideas in different places of the Ottoman domains, but I can't find the interaction between these people? So then you start to see that the domains is connected in a way that we have to move beyond our imagination in the way that we look at it.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Okay, these were great, but we are now jumping off to some really a number of wonderful questions from our audience. So I'd love to thank everyone for these questions. So I'll start with two questions from Yahya Bird for each of our speakers. To Dr. Yılmaz, the Yahya Bird asks, what was the historical impact of the mystical caliphate as a political idea? Did it carry through into the present or spread outside the historic Ottoman domains? And for Yakoob, Yahya Bird's question is, he says, I completely agree with the deep yet sadly underplayed continuities between the post-caliphal revivalist movements and constitutionalism among the ulama and others in Turkey, Egypt, or Iran. How do we use this shared history to bridge the chasm between Sufis and Islamists today after the Arab Spring? So Hüseyin Hocam, if you can go first to the question of did the Ottoman, the mystical caliphate as a political idea carry through into the present or spread outside the historic Ottoman domains?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. The first impact was the question of legitimacy, because the Ottomans, per juristic theory, had major legitimacy problem, because 10th century, mostly Abbasid jurists theorized the historical caliphate in the sense that suits to the historical traditional caliphal authority. So one of those conditions among many was the caliph's descent from the Quraysh tribe. Okay, so some jurists such as Ibn Khaldun gave some different interpretations to that, contextualized that condition, but in the main, including the Abbasids, the jurists understood that the claimant of the caliphate had to come from the Quraysh tribe. So the Ottomans did not have that quality. So they could not possibly become a legitimate caliphate in the first place. So you bypassing this juristic set of conditions and reframing themselves in the mystical notions as caliphate, they didn't need that. So they could be equally legitimate caliphate on the basis of a totally different interpretation. Secondly, it brought about diversity and accommodation. So unlike the historical caliphate, mystical caliphate entails a mystical interpretation of what God's will is and how God's authority is manifest on earth, okay, through its traits. So, for example, one of the most principal understandings of what mystical caliphate was since Ibn Arabi, that the caliph has to manifest God's Rahman trait. Okay, so without becoming the manifestation of Rahman trait, you cannot be a caliph. All other traits and qualities of the caliphate emanates from that. So unless you become compassionate to God's creatures in the way God himself is, you cannot reflect God's authority. Therefore, you cannot be a caliph. That requires your accommodation of all the diversity in your realm. So that entails a trust from God. And thirdly, I will say creativity, because juristic interpretation of the caliphate was normative. Based on the textual evidence from the Quran and the Hadith, and mostly from Hadiths, not from the Quran. So it was a very structured understanding of the caliphate. Whereas the mystical caliphate emphasized on the very human qualities of authority rather than the institutional qualities of authority. So juristic caliphate is all about a contract between the community and the wielder of authority, and the wielder of caliphate authority has certain obligations, etc. These are all structured, all normative, all juristic, legal. In the case of Sufism today, focus on the very human qualities. How can we make the wielder of the caliph as true manifestation of God's just and compassionate authority on earth?
Thank you. And if there's a follow-up, yeah, okay, I am seeing a thumbs up. So thank you for that. So Yakoob, over to you for the second question.
Question again.
Yes, sure. So the question reads, I completely agree with the deep yet sadly underplayed continuities between the post-Caliphal revivalist movements and constitutionalism among the ulama and others in Turkey, Egypt, or Iran. How do we use this shared history to bridge the chasm between Sufis and Muslims today after the Arab Spring?
So, yeah, that's a really loaded question. We should have a cup of tea when I come down to London next time and go through this. So, look, okay, so let me explain what's interesting is, so in the time of Selim III, when the necessity comes into place about the transformation of the Ottoman military and the Janissary itself, right? We see a lot of Naqshbandi influence in Istanbul. And actually that shouldn't be downplayed. The Naqshi influence in Istanbul as a Sufi tariqat is just as instrumental in the idea of the notion of the caliphate as the sort of like just ulumi centers that maybe, or the ilmiya centers that don't subscribe to any particular tariqat and so forth. And so what you see in Istanbul during the time of Selim III is you see, let me break down the multiple powers that exist so that we can understand what's going on here. You have the Janissaries, you have the Janissaries being inspired by the Bektashi order, but I don't think the Bektashi order has any influence on the House of Osman, okay? You have the Sultan in the House of Osman itself. You have the ilmiya structure, and it's important to understand the ulama as part of the ilmiya doesn't mean all the ulama. They're ulama outside of the ilmiya structure. So they're ulama as state actors and ulama as non-state actors. You then see the influence of the ayan, which are the magnates, the local provincial power magnates who have their own militias because the domains is not centralized. And then you have this movement, because of what's happening in the Crimea in particular, the loss of the Crimean Khanate in 1774, and this movement of many of these Muslims from the Russian areas we would call now, into Istanbul. Sultan Ahmed saying he has a heart attack because of this loss. And it's the first time we see the documentation of the caliph in a land that's been lost, right? So the Crimea is lost. The Küçük Kaynarca document is that we are still the caliphate, and you see the intensification of that. And then what you start to see then is this amalgamation of these different actors all making a claim towards what authority is and what the caliphate is in itself. And what's interesting here is Sufis in themselves are very strongly instrumental in this idea. They are very politicized. And in fact, a lot of the soldiers who go on the war efforts, in the Greek revolts in particular, they're inspired by the Naqshis. And the Naqshis are the ones who are driving the modernization of the military. And if you look at Ibn Abidin in Damascus, for example, who's known as the famous Hanafi jurist, he's Naqshi inspired. He's the student of Sheikh Khalid in Damascus. So what you're seeing is that even in this period, that there is an influence of a politicized Sufi tariqat that sees Islam within the prism of politics that wouldn't have been alien to anyone. And so now we stretch it forward and we go forward in time, you now start to see the contestation. And so this is why I want to talk about this verse, because the verse is Ya ayyuhallazina amanu, right? So the idea is, in the ulama say that Allah Ta'ala is speaking to the Muslims as an ummah. Oh, you who believe. Oh, you who believe. So it starts with that. That's the target audience that they're speaking to. Then it says, obey Allah. And then obey the messenger. So we'll stop there for a second. So the injunction is that the ummah being told, you have to obey Allah and you have to obey the messenger. That's your shahada. There, fixed. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. So that's their aqidah in it. And then it says, and obey those. Now the distinction came between one, why does it not say, and those in authority from amongst you? Why does it not say, and obey those in authority? It says, obey Allah, obey the messenger, and those in authority from amongst you. So the question is there a issue of disobedience permitted here? The idea is those in authority amongst you can only be, you only give them obedience if they obey Allah and the messenger. There's a condition here. And the second constitutional period, as we call Mashru'iyyat, right?
Yeah. Yakoob, I am just interrupting because there is a related question, which I am assuming that this is the verse that the questioner Bilal Tonyal is right. Asking. If you have off the top of your head, how did Hamdi Yazır and Mel interpret the verse?
Okay. So now, all right, that's great. All right, so now what happens is you see the contestation first is the mainly people driven by the Naqshi ideology belief, and those in authority from amongst you is the caliph, and it's the caliph alone. And you have to submit to the caliph, and there can be no disobedience to the caliph, because this is a rhetorical device. Obey Allah, obey the messenger, and those in authority. It actually means, and obey those in authority after you, right? What we see in the Young Turk, the constitutional revolution of 1908, people like Hamdi Yazır, people like Mustafa Sabri, people like Sayyid Nursi as well, including, they look at this and say, no, the people of authority are the ulama, the people of authority are the military class, the people of authority are people that are authorities in society. It's the mechanism. So what's coming down to is how they see political power and the configuration of the various institutions within the Ottoman domains. Muhammad Abdul makes a similar claim in Egypt. Rashid Ridda is making a similar claim. All right. So what you're seeing here is that this is even more fascinating. So Musa Kazim Effendi, who is the Sheikh al-Islam for the Young Turk government, the CUP government in 1909, he says that the idea that the authority belongs to the ummah. And he bases it on this idea, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu, right? That the ummah are being spoken to, and their obedience should be only given to those in authority based on the fact that Islam is followed. So we see the emergence of the idea of public opinion, and the ummah have an opinion, and the ummah are part of this configuration of power. So now what we see is that if we break this up, because Hamdi Yazır starts to explain this in his Quran tafsir, probably because he's one of the revolutionaries in 1908 who's moving against what's perceived as Hamidian constraints upon the ulama class and what's happening in the domains. And he's loosening it up, just like Mustafa Sabri Effendi is saying, we are also included, by the way, in this authority. It's not just you, the caliph, and so forth, right? And so it extends to the second verse very quickly, and then I'm really sorry, which is when the second verse, when I told you is in Surah Al-Imran, which is the verse of Shura, because the verse in Shura is an address to Rasul Sallam. That verse is addressing the Prophet himself. So now Musa Kazim Effendi says, this verse is telling the Prophet to take Shura, and then afterwards it says, and Allah Ta'ala loves the one who basically who have made that decision. So then once you do the shura, then the decision is in the hands of Allah, and Allah loves the ones who makes the decision. Musa Kazim Effendi argued that this was binding, that shura was an obligation, it wasn't a choice. Other members of the ulama said it's possible, it's rewardable, and so forth. And what you're seeing is this breakdown of how they're looking at political authority, and you start to see this in the works of Muslims around the world. So Ridda, because Ridda is very inspirational towards certain Muslims in India, Ridda is not in Istanbul. So Ridda is being inspired by what's happening in Istanbul, because there's a constitutional movement in Syria in 1921, in which Ridda is part of the constitutional movement. And Ridda has already interacted with Mustafa Sabri, because both of them have written books on the Khilafah already. So what you start, this is, you know what I mean? So this is what I found really interesting here. It's fascinating in that sense.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. That's deep. Okay, so we have quite a number of questions, and also Mizan tells me that quite a number of hands raised as well. So what we'll try to do, we'll go above our time, but at the same time, we'll try to be mindful of the time, because our Istanbul-based scholars, they are approaching iftar time. So they're kindly not being hangry with us. We are grateful for that. So 2 questions. Professor Yılmaz, for you first, and then for Ahmed. And if you can try to address that maybe in relationship to one another. One of the questions from Dili Hüseyin is, how does Imam al-Mawardi's al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya differ with the Ottoman/Sufi understanding of caliphate and political thought? That is one question. And then a second question I'm seeing from Jahangir Mohammed is, has the debate that you have alluded to in about the 3 levels of authority found its way into the Iran constitutional debate, and has that debate eventually influenced the contemporary Shia political thought leading to Khomeini's revolution, if at all?
Hüseyin Hoca, you can go first.
Very good question. Again, Mawardi was, of course, the classical theorist of juristic, the notion of the caliphate. And to begin with, Mawardi was never translated into Ottoman Turkish, but Ottoman jurists were very aware of Mawardi. In fact, Shafi law was widely taught in Ottoman madrasas as well. And we have plenty of copies of Mawardi's Ahkam al-Sultaniyya in Ottoman library. So Ottomans were very well aware of the overall juristic theory on the caliphate, including that of the Mawardi. However, Mawardi's theory did not apply to the Ottomans, because Mawardi, as other jurists, talks about imam or imamate. So the juristic notion was actually not the caliphate, but imamate. So only as an attribution of historical authority, we call the juristic imamate caliphate. But the technical term was in juristic theory was as a contractual authority. It was imamate. It is called caliphate only by reference to the holders of that early authority who named themselves since Abu Bakr as caliph. However, the mystical interpretation or reinterpretation of the caliphate is not in any way in conflict with the juristic theory. It doesn't deal with that institutional contractual authority of the imamate. What the Sufistic theory says, the holder of authority, unless unifies all these 3 natures of the prophet, namely become representative of all these 3 natures of the prophet, cannot be a caliph. So in Mawardian sense, for example, anybody who is displaying the juristic qualifications such as knowledge, sanity, justice, descent from the Quraysh tribe, and who receives bay'ah, the contract from the community, and then he is the caliph. He is the imam, and by extension, caliph. However, from a sophistic perspective, the very person who has all these qualifications may not be a caliph, because the sophistic understanding of caliphate was completely based on the Quranic interpretation of Adam's caliphate, namely as somebody who actually represents the overall God's governance of his as his creation. So that requires the sophistic interpretation of the caliphate focuses on the very human qualities, such as unlike the social or institutional dimensions of rulership.
Thank you. On the Iran question, very briefly.
Can you tell me the question? My memory is fasting. It's killing me. I can't remember.
I think the Iran question is for Hüseyin Hoca. If so, whether the question was asking to what extent the three levels of authority found its way into Iran's constitutional debate, and has it eventually influenced the contemporary Shi'i political thought leading to Khomeini's revolution? I don't know if you have any insights on that, Hüseyin Hoca.
That's a whole different topic. However, just to entertain the question, the sophistic interpretation of the caliphate actually has much more in common with the broader Shiite tradition. Not that they were fed or emanate from the same origin, but in the sense that the wielder of authority has to display certain qualities as manifestation of the broader authority or cosmic order and authority of the divine. So in that sense, there are a lot of similarities we could see. It's just one major difference. In Shiism, that authority is set. It's by birth. So you simply inherit that authority by birth up to the 12th Imam, and in other Shi'i branches such as Ismaili is a different story, but still it is an inherited authority. In Sunni interpretations of Sufistic caliphate, it's not inherited. It is acquired on the basis of one's worthiness, one's merit. It is granted, it's bestowed by the divine, and that person could be anybody. So that made caliphate, quote unquote, a very democratic claim. That made it very approachable, very humane, very contestable, and very competitive. Because anybody now can claim to be a caliphate. In order to be a true caliphate, you have to be able to display those required qualities and qualifications. Only that way you can be a true caliph. Not that simply by receiving the loyalty of your subjects or having executive power or your descent from the Quraysh tribe or your descent from imams, those do not make you caliph. What makes you caliph is displaying the very traits that God displays in his governance of his creation.
Thank you so much. Mizan, did you want to interpret? Or if not, I think you're on mute, so we cannot hear you.
Who do you want to take the question? We have Dilly and Naveed Ashraf.
Yeah, so Naveed Ashraf's question is the first question that will go to Yakoob Ahmed, the one that I am seeing in the chat, I guess. So Yakoob, a very good question from Naveed Ashraf. In the 1908 period, do we see a convergence of the ulama and political conceptions of power and authority, or do we see a diversion? And he is expanding on the question, saying, so in other words, do the ulama see themselves as advisors with a limited authority that Abdul Hamid can arbitrate, or do they see themselves as more than that?
Depends who it is. So when you've seen generally in the movement, people like Mustafa Sabri in particular, because when the constitutional amendments are made in 1909, it's the ulama who make those amendments, so Hamdi Yazad and the committee. And the idea is that the ulama are trying to exercise via legal mechanism now. No longer is there like a physical force like the Janissaries, although the revolution is done in some ways via military means. So the rise of the CUP to some degree is very unique because in some ways they resemble something like the Janissaries in the sense that they become this unique, fluid meta-institution, right? And so as a result of that, the ulama to some degree, and this is where the works of Hamdi Yazar and Sabri become interesting, is that they try to position themselves not only as a check and balance on sultanic authority, but they try to position themselves as a check and balance of the Ilmiya class in itself. So the Ilmiya structure has an established structure, and what they do is they create a organization, an ulama organization amongst themselves to be able to hold the Sheikh al-Islam to account. And this is what we're starting to see in that period, unique, this emergence of what we would call political parties in that sense. And this is very unique because to some degree, the ulama got caught off guard with the emergence of the CUP as a political party, because traditionally the institutions made very clear sense. It was the ulama in the ilmiya, the military class, and the House of Osman and so forth. But now you see this emergence of this political movement in a parliamentary system, and the ulama had needed a bit of time to make sense of that. I don't think they had enough time to make sense of that, totally, in some ways. And what's interesting is they start to become parliamentarians, join political parties, and then try to establish their own political parties to some degree to see how that works. And then this adds on to Yahya Burt's question in terms of what happens now. Well, to some degree, there was still a difference of opinion in terms of state ulama and non-state ulama. And non-state ulama often were unable to use the tools of the state. And so revolution was the most extreme form of negotiation with the state. And they would mobilize the masses, which is public opinion, against the state, so that the state would adhere and listen to their ideas and thoughts. And they were negotiating with the ulama, the higher ulama in the ilmiya class. And so what it indicates is that in the Ottoman context, the belief was the ulama had to be part of the political structure, and had to be representatives of the masses as well, and they had to be that glue in between the two. And if that didn't happen, then it's not only the morality of Islam misses within the political structure, but then that constant mechanism that holds the state to account, or the caliph to account, that holds the ummah to account and holds the other mechanisms, and to hold themselves to account is missing. So that becomes really interesting.
There's a follow-up question. I think it relates to this from Jahangir Mohammed, asking that, explaining that he's saying, didn't the Ottomans effectively destroy themselves? And also, isn't it the notion of the independence of the ulama to hold sultans to account questionable? Did they hold any sultan to account for murder of their siblings or other un-Islamic acts that they committed?
They did that continuously. I mean, this is the thing that people did, and this is the amnesia that I'm talking about. We're looking at short 10-minute. I'm not suggesting to this person, but just general 10-minute videos on YouTube, and we're making the assumption that the ulama was somehow silent. The ulama throughout Ottoman history, from the inception of the Beylik of Orhan and Osman Ghazi, are part of that state-building process, to the idea of what Fatih is doing, to the idea of Bayezid and the movement of that, to even a late period. So even the issue of fratricide is really interesting. The idea that the ulama had a uniformed opinion is incorrect. There's a lot of sultans moving ulama out of position. So I give an example of the revolution of 1908 just to help people understand. The revolution in 1908, Sultan Abdul Hamid had asked for a fatwa from the Sheikh al-Islam to crush the rebellion in the Balkan provinces. When the petition was sent to the Sheikh al-Islam, he says, why do you want to crush it? He says, it's a rebellion. But the rebellion had a civilian component. The Sheikh al-Islam at the time said, you cannot crush this rebellion because it has a civilian component, and he went against the Sultan. All right, that same fatwa eminent, the person who wrote the fatwa, in 1909, when they were asked to remove Abdul Hamid from power, he would refuse to do it. He said, no, actually, this has gone too far. So we sometimes don't realize that these people had independent agency. They had the capacity to make these choices, and their choices were not uniform. When we say didn't the ulama, these are human beings have consciousness. And different ulama in different periods, at different moments in Ottoman history, made different choices for various reasons. And we need to see it like that. We really need to understand that rather than looking at it as blanket, we really need to go into each situation on the merits of its own situation and understand why choices were made for that reason.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
We have a question from Billy.
The Abbasid Caliphate question.
I think, yeah, I'll just unmute Dilly. Yeah.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, Hoja Yakoob, Hüseyin Yılmaz. Pray you both well. Pray everyone's well. I wanted to ask a question to Dr. Yılmaz. He basically said that after 1258, after the sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols, the kind of more conventional and kind of orthodox understanding and manifestation of the Khilafah or Caliphate was no longer there. If that's the case, then how would he personally define or explain the Caliphate that did exist from 1261 right up until 1517, which was essentially the preservation of the Abbasid household by the Mamluks. And yes, they were ceremonious and they had very little to no executive power. But how does he explain that? That kind of 250 or so years before Selim Yılmaz came and took power?
Very good question. So I understand your question as what do Sufis think about it, right? There's no single person on this question.
That period between 1261, when the Abbasids were reinstated, nominally, ceremoniously by the Mamluks, until the Battle of Marj Dabik, when they were defeated by Selim, that period there. Because the Sunnis, many Sunnis would argue that, yes, there was a caliphate still there, albeit very weak and ceremonious. That's what, generally speaking, that's how it would be argued.
Of course. Yes, a number of jurists actually had to revise the theory of the caliphate after the demise of the Abbasid Caliphate. Some argued that, first of all, actually that started even before the demise of the Abbasid Caliphate. With the Selçukid arrival to Baghdad, the founder of the Selçukid dynasty, Tuğrul Bey, actually acquired a new title, which is totally new and never repeated afterwards. He called himself through the caliph's own decree as Qasimul Caliph. So he became a partner in the caliphate. So caliphate, way before the Mongols, was actually partitioned. So Selçukids considered themselves as equal partners in the caliphate as much as the house of the Abbasids. So that doesn't mean only there is one type of juristic. Actually, Mawardi's work was just to justify that, because Mawardi argued that to fit it into the juristic scheme, he argued that there may, of course, be only one imam at a time, but that imam may have executive representatives, which means who could exercise independent judgment. So he sort of said the Selçukid ruler Tuğrul Bey and then afterwards Alparslan were the caliph's representatives as he calls it al-wazir al-tanfiz, tafwiz. So these are tafwizi wazirs. That was his understanding. Afterwards, many argued that there may be multiple caliphs. That doesn't have to be one caliph over the entire ummah. So that's why they argued that if there's a mountain, a sea range in between different communities, there may be different caliphs. Some even questioned the very nature of the caliphate, such as Ibn Taymiyyah. So Ibn Taymiyyah came up with the idea that what is at stake in any form of authority is the application of the law, he said, the Sharia. So as long as the Sharia is supreme and applied, it doesn't matter who applies it or how many different authorities out there. And then Mamluk jurists such as Tarsusi and others also argued that they legitimized the Mamluk rulers in the broader framework of the caliphate, in the sense that the caliph, despite being ceremonial, the Mamluk ruler was thought to have received his authority from the caliph, but he was virtually independent. And there are many jurists who actually referred to the Mamluk ruler also a caliph. So in short, in that period, there were many caliphs across the Muslim world because it could be justified and legitimized in reference to different juristic principles. given that the Qurayshi descent could also be contextualized. For example, some jurists argued that in the hadith, it was stipulated, the Qurayshi descent is not the Qurayshi tribe per se, but power. So at the time, Qurayshi tribe was the most powerful. So as long as you belong to a powerful constituency that gives you enough authority to execute your authority, then you don't have to actually descend from the Qurayshi. So we have all range of interpretations. However, the Ottomans in 1517 did not feel and did not seek to inherit the Abbasid Caliphate. It wasn't in the air at the time. It wasn't debated by Ottoman jurists, and there was even no ceremony. All the fanfare and stories regarding the Ottoman inheritance of the Caliphate after the invasion of Egypt was later elaborations. So there was no such. Selim never felt that he inherited the Caliphate from the Abbasid one from Cairo. So institutional Caliphate was virtually at least dysfunctional in the wake of the demise of the Abbasid Empire. It was basically irrelevant. So there were more powerful claims of authority on the basis of Sufism, or even more elaborate genealogies, such as the Genghis Khan's genealogy, which was a whole different question.
Thank you, Hüseyin Hocam. Mizan, if there are no other hand raised, I see one more question in the chat box that I'd like to address.
Yeah, please. Yeah, if you just answer, take the questions from the chat box. Yeah.
Sure. Dr. Ahmed, so one of the questions from Mohammed Al-Faki has two parts. One is, what essential texts would you recommend for the fall of the Ottoman Empire? And what scholar in the Ottoman Empire has the most influential text on political theory? I think we can get answers from both of you to this question. I know it's usually a tricky one.
I'm going to be pretty frank. I've said this a lot. We need to move away from shortcutting and just picking up books and say this book will give us the answer. What I have always pushed, and what I hope, when I agreed with Mizan to do this, because many of you know I'm very private and I don't like doing this at all. But when I agreed to do this was with the hope that those of you that are behind the screen will kick on and start to invest in Ottoman studies. And actually what we need is more seminars on Ottoman studies within Muslim communities and societies, so they have a better understanding, not just of the 19th century, but 600 years of works. That means we need more writers, more investment, and more conversations.
We need a center for Ottoman studies.
We need a center for Ottoman studies too, yes. So the idea is, I've said this before, we need intellectual investment. That's what's necessary, not only in Ottoman studies. And so rather than just giving you a book, I'm not going to give you a book. Now, for the second part of the question, there are many interesting thinkers. Sayyid Halim Pasha was one of them, who I thought was very interesting. Mustafa Sabri Effendi is another one of them, which I find interesting. Most people have access to the Arab scholars like Rida and so forth. But the scholars in Istanbul, because of the inability to read Ottoman Turkish, it becomes a lot harder. But a lot of these works now are being translated into English by many wonderful scholars in the field of Ottoman studies. So what we need to do is, rather than me just giving you a list of books, I think we should be, part of the Islamic pedagogy is discussion, debate, and so forth. We need to be encouraging this more and more so that we can be producers of knowledge. I've complained about this before. I'm tired of the Muslim communities being consumers of knowledge. We need producers of knowledge. So please, let's kick on from this. So you can contact me privately and I can give you a bibliography list if that makes you happy. But what I would like to see is more and more people invested not only in Ottoman studies, but in the Islamic sciences in particular, across the board, and make this accessible to as many people as possible. This platform in itself has given us the ability to do that. Inshallah, you can continue with that. And so please kick on from that. I'm sorry if I don't mean to be rude or patronizing. Really, I don't. I'm saying this from my heart. I want people to be better than me and kick on from the subject. I've seen many wonderful young Muslims who have better skills than I do. And I really think they can do wonderful things if we just invest in them as human beings.
Mm-hmm. No, wonderful, thank you. Hüseyin Hocam, same question, maybe with a different band. I mean, if you want to address it, if you have a most influential text on political theory or reading suggestion about the fall of the Ottoman Empire, but also perhaps if you could talk about what like cultural history, literature, and those kind of texts and sources have informed your own study to maybe also unpack this as merely as political history that alludes to both Ottoman Empire and other historical and cultural media that we want to study.
If you're asking to an Ottomanist to advise a book on the demise of the Ottomans, you won't get an answer. That said, I would recommend actually primary sources because every secondary source has its own analysis, historiographical approach, etc. Unless you're a specialist, of course, if you want to read a bunch of them, I can. But given that, or assuming that you are not planning to be a specialist on Ottoman history, I would say read primary sources. One very short primary source about the end of the Ottoman Empire, which Yakoob may know better, is Yusuf Akçura's Üç Tarzı Siyaset, Three Policies. I can give you the translator. It's translated by David S. Thomas, and the title is Three Policies, and it's available online. So you can read it online. It's just 20 pages of text. It's and he's Yusuf Akçura is from late Ottoman intellectual. He discusses three major ideologies that were at work in late Ottoman, in the final decades of the Ottoman Empire. And then you can read Said Halim Pasha. I don't think it was translated into English, but available in French and Turkish. About what the Ottoman culture and ideals were in the in the 16th and 17th centuries, I would suggest reading Katip Çelebi to give a very deeper insight and perspective into Ottomans' thinking and perception of the broader world. Katip Çelebi has a book which I would say unique in the history of Islamic civilization. It's a collection of essays on popular topics of his time. So Katip Çelebi was connected, was not from the ulama. He was an intellectual of mid 17th century. He was a geographer. He was a bibliographer. He wrote so many books on his own, but his discussion of popular topics of his time is very, very interesting. The title of the book is Mizan al-Haq. It was translated into English as The Balance of Truth, and the translator is Godfrey Lewis.
This is almost a nod to our organizer, Mizan, I guess, a closing nod to you with Katip Çelebi's Mizan al-Haq as a recommended reading for everyone. Okay, so I think we did what seemed to be a difficult task, thanks to our scholars of answering I think most questions.
Sure. Can we talk about the Meydan now? So because we're coming to the end, because obviously, So sure. Would you like to talk about the before we get
Absolutely.
a final please.
So the Meydan is the Center for Global Islamic Studies is at George Mason University's public-facing scholarship platform and online publication that seeks to be a space and site for conversations on Islamic studies broadly defined from multiple different disciplines, multiple different time eras, and at the same time, a resource site. So we started the Meydan in 2016 at George Mason University. And since then, we have been able to more or less achieve some of our goals, if not all of them. One was to approach Islam as a global religion and to be able to speak about Islam in Nigeria as much as Islam in Indonesia, as we speak about Islam in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Iran, in some of the more conventional spaces. We have a focus on Islam in the West, in the US and the UK as well. That's my own research area, Islam in the United States. So partly coming from that, but I'd love to encourage everyone who is listening to us, hopefully, to consider contributing to the Meydan by following, by making sure that you submit your research. We do publish shorter versions of previously published work. We do publish new research on ongoing dynamics. We do have resources for scholars, such as a journal roundup, book roundups, and most recently we have published one on the qualifier exams or the comprehensive exams, particularly for those who might be
And you
on
have
the,
a colloquium in Ottoman studies coming up, right?
Yes, so the image that you are seeing is, this is going to go public hopefully later today. So you're seeing a preview, August 7 and 8. The second graduate colloquium in Ottoman studies will take place this year online. Last year it was organized in Istanbul for graduate students, advanced PhD students, August 7 and 8. The application deadline will be June 8. So for those of you who are listening or working on this subject and who want to be in conversation with fellow advanced PhD students and experts of the field, including Hüseyin Hoca and many others, please do send your applications, and we'll post the details on the Meydan as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, Ahmed, final thoughts from our speakers, and Alhan. Yeah, bismillah.
Yes, maybe 2-3 minute closing remarks from both of you. Perhaps Dr. Ahmed, we can start with you.
So first of all, I just want to say thank you very much. Mizan has worked really hard to dig me out, and I appreciate the giving me the opportunity and the platform to be able to express some of my thoughts and ideas. I hope in any shape or form I wasn't rude to anyone while I was speaking. I'm a very as we say in England, I wear my heart on my sleeve. It's a football terminology where you are the captain, and I'm that type of person. But my intention and my hope was, and I'm really appreciative that I was given a platform with someone like Hüseyin Hoca, who's a far more decorated and respected academic than I am. In that sense, I'm quite a bit of a baby here. So I hope I haven't spoken out of terms in any shape or form. If I have, then my sincerest apologies. But I just love Ottoman history. I really enjoyed reading about it, and it was very private and personal for me. But what I realize is that there is a demand for people to want to know more. Then let's do this. Let's try to want to know more. And one of the things that concerns me is we have these humongous assumptions, and we need to move away from those assumptions. And the investment in Ottoman studies in particular, in some ways, Yahya Burt's question was quite pertinent because he linked it to the failure of the so-called Arab Spring. The ramifications, while yes, the formation of the nation states and a lot has happened, World War I, World War II, the creation of the State of Israel, the Gulf Wars and so forth. Having said that, there's still a lot of cultural, intellectual and social memory in the region and in the world by and large that stems back to the earlier period. And the fact that we don't know that is concerning for me. So I want to see more in the community, and you can hold me accountable here if you feel that I'm not invested enough in the community. I can take that as a responsibility, and that's my, and I'm sorry about that. But what I want is hopefully I can inspire better speakers and thinkers than me to invest in this, and we will try to find ways of getting you the funding. Rizq comes from Allah Ta'ala. I say this as a Muslim. I trust in Allah Ta'ala, and He'll find ways. Imam Ghazali said, if you move towards Allah Ta'ala in ibadat, He doesn't put obstacles in your ways to stop doing the ibadat. Ilm is ibadat, it's worship. Please move towards it, and Allah Ta'ala will make it easy. And we will find ways as a community. We do have the resources. We may just lack in the human power, but even that we have. So let's get creative, let's pull together, and let's please invest in the subject area. And I look forward to you guys being wonderful historians and intellectuals and thinkers in the various fields that you're in. And I pray that we can kick on from this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm into that. Hüseyin Hoca.
Yeah, me too. Likewise, I would like to thank to wonderful questions from the audience, to my co-speaker, to Yakoob for giving a wonderful presentation about Ottoman constitutionalism, and to moderators as well, to Mizan and Ahmed. It was Mizan and Haq kind of presentation. I'll say a few broad observations about actually how can we better read and engage with the overall history of Muslim or Islamic societies, because it is still suffering from a range of well-established, very limiting understandings or embedded misconceptions or prejudices. One is the very diversity, including, so I'm at the same time talking about the case of the Ottomans, but we can broaden this to the other Muslim societies as well. So there is a very diverse historical experience we witness. It's very cosmopolitan. It's very syncretic. There is no, it's not a kind of historical experience you can easily frame up under few rubrics or few concepts. So to truly understand Ottoman history, Ottoman intellectual history, or Ottoman political thought, we have to factor in all the diverse experiences of Ottoman society overall went through, how much they knew about Islam, how did they understand Islam, in what ways did they engage with the broader Islamic tradition, and how did they live Islam. It's not entirely the same. Of course, there are many commonalities between among the Ottomans, or between the Ottomans versus Mughals or other in Iran, etc. But the sheer diversity is very telling to properly understand how, in practice, Islamic ideals were unfolded. Another problem is to understand or the tendency to understand certain Islamic concepts as frozen in history. That is almost always misleading. And a very good example is caliphate. So including the experts, there's a tendency to understand that, okay, there was a caliphate since the time of Abu Bakr, and all the Muslims since Abu Bakr understood caliphate the same way. So what we are doing is just the application of the caliphate. No, the very understanding of the caliphate also changes from generation to generation, from intellectual to intellectual, because every generation engages with the very fundamental texts of Islam. Just like Abu Yusuf read Hadith, a 16th century Ottoman jurists or Sufis also reading Hadiths, and they are trying to reach the best possible understanding of what prophet to prophet or the God meant in those texts. So their understanding might be different than what a 10th century Abbasid jurist might have thought of it. A third point I would briefly talk about would be the avoidance of idealizations. We are very prone to idealize certain practices or certain kinds of understandings. But if you look at the broader history of Muslim societies, it's very selective what we are actually highlighting as the representative ideas, ideals, or forms, or institutions. For example, the very just another question brought up the idealization that the ulama in history always stood up against political authorities. No, there are ulama who stood up against political authorities, and there are ulama who acted as representatives and sort of servile representatives of political authorities. So we have many, many different manifestations as to how these ideals were practiced. So there is no monolithic ulama. There is no monolithic or stereotypical Sufis we are talking about. So things change, and that very idea of change even made its way into Ottoman political thought. For example, one of the major principles you come across very frequently in Ottoman political texts is the principle which says, with the change of circumstances, rules also change. It's also happened to be one of the fundamental principles of Hanafi law. So once the circumstances on the ground change, former rules may not apply. You have to adapt those earlier rules to new circumstances. So Ottoman history is very diverse, very dynamic, very accommodative of human change. So we have to take those or keep those in mind while reading any part of the history of Muslim societies. Thank you again.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. As a non-specialist of the field, I benefited immensely from this discussion and from all the questions. Again, with gratitude to Islamic Courses, to Mizan for organizing, for hosting this. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And once again, thank you to our distinguished panelists, speakers, and also Ahmed for being an excellent host and chair. Can I please recommend everyone, please, to visit and support the Maidan, which is an online publication at the Ali Vural AK Center for Global Islamic Studies at GMU, which is in the States. Very important, we need to support our own institutions, whether online, offline, and we need to support our scholarships like Dr. Hüseyin, Dr. Yakoob, and this has been one of our biggest sessions, longest sessions, just shows the interest in Ottoman studies. We really need more Ottoman centers for studying. So it's just proof in the pudding. Really, the Muslim community has the money, has the willpower. It just has to, you know, as a Mizan statement will be, stop shopping in Dubai and put your money where it needs to be. You know, you need to put your money into studying and researching, which is something very important. But anyway, without a doubt, thank you so much, brothers and sisters. If you haven't left your email address, if you're already registered, you'll get a copy. If you're not on our mailing list or registration list, please leave your email address there. And once again, just to remind everyone, tomorrow's session is very important. We have Dr. Ahmed. Ahmed is originally from India, and he's written an excellent book, Religion as a Critique, Islamic Critical Thinking from Mecca to the Marketplace. And it's very important with the rise of Islamophobia in India. He makes an interesting and very important argument using the whole Islamic in India, especially focusing on the large part on the South Asian traditions, and interrogates Greek and Enlightenment notions of reason and critique. And please join us for that. He's an up-and-coming young academic as well. Please support him as well in tomorrow's session. Thank you so much once again. Please make dua for us as you break your fast. Those in Istanbul, he's coming up, and those in London, well, I think we've got a couple of hours to go, 2 hours to go anyway. Alhamdulillah, inshallah, without further ado, we'll see you tomorrow, inshallah. Take care. Wa akhiran, alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.